Maya culture begins in earnest during the first centuries of the first millennium AD, which coincides with what has come to be known as the classic period of Central Mexican civilizations, or at least the beginning of the classical period, epitomized by the famous temple complexes of the so-called Toltecs, people of the reedy waters, Tolan, situated at Teotihuacan, an hour drive north of Mexico City. The massive pyramid of the sun that is situated in the center of this early metropolis lies more or less equidistant to the northern Temple of the Moon, another pyramid, and the southern Temple of the Toltec feathered serpent, Quetzal-coatl. A system of extended terraces link all three pyramids in the center of the cityscape, each level of which was regulated by a water lock, suggesting that a river that once bisected the landscape ran downward through the city, ending up among the surroundings of the Temple of Quetzalcoatl. A number of neighborhoods and adjunct religious centers were distributed throughout the city, including the famous Temple of Tenochtitlan, whose polychrome murals record the early Toltec vision of Tolan, the watery paradise of their pantheon, and the land that came to be known as Tlaloc or Tamoanchan of the Aztecs. Much as with the Maya, the water lily is a prominent feature of this paradise, and proved no less central to the lives of many Central Mexican gods and goddesses. We encounter among the murals of Tenochtitlan portrayals of gods and goddesses that serve as divine donors of the sacred flowers. Or perhaps these figures represent Toltec impersonators that donned costumes to masquerade as deities that they worshipped. Either way, the setting is an aquatic wonderland where plants, animals, and the Toltecs flourished among fluxions of fertile and clear waters. One of the figures wears a Quetzal headdress and sets forth a flow of pure waters that is chock full of lotus buds and blossoms, many in the bud and blossom motif lineage. The Quetzal headdress relates to a wet tropical bird species of lowland wet tropical Maya habitats that would never be encountered naturally in the dry, mesquite-dominated surrounding of Teotihuacan. But the bird's long emerald green feathers were valued more than gold in this region of the world. Its name, in the language of Nahuatl, the idiom of the Mexica during the 16th century, Quetzali, refers either to this particular bird species or means otherwise preciousness. We note here that the color of the Quetzal's feathers match with the color of the water lily flowers. Right beside the bird god, we encounter an anthropomorphic image of Quetzal-coatl, the proverbial feathered serpent, or what is known now in Mexico as the Serpente emplumado. The headdress is a massive serpent's head that bears long streaming quetzali feathers. Once again, pure waters gush from the hands of the god figure with a bounteous outpouring of precious water lily buds and flowers. In this, and the case of the Quetzal deity, the water lilies are blue and yellow pigmented, which identifies them as the only known blue pigmented water lily species in Mexico, Nymphaea elegans, and the only yellow flowered water lily species of Mexico, Nymphaea mexicana. While the abundance of water lilies in watery habitats during the age of the Toltecs and the Aztecs was likely a natural feature, today one is very hard-pressed to even find clean waters in central Mexico, much less water lilies. Indeed, the Valley of Mexico is now congested by people, and is actually one of the world's largest urban centers. Quetzalcoatl is not the only generous source of water at Tolan. So too are the water lilies, which drip incessantly and abundantly with nectar on the murals of Tenochtitlan. This detail reflects the unique character of water lily flowers, as earlier noted. For water lilies represent the only flowering plant group in the world that produces a thimbleful of nectar on the first day of flowering to actually wash pollen grains off their insect visitors. The murals at Tenochtitlan provide a useful and surprisingly clear reference point for the investigation of the pyramid of Quetzalcoatl, located about a half mile to the south of these murals. Here we encounter the early confluence of various Mesoamerican features that date to around the 3rd century AD, including a pyramidal structure of talud tablero construction, the backdrop of a watery underworld, and of course the hallowed feathered serpent. Apart from the scattered shell motifs, a clear indication of an aquatic theme, there are 3 fundamental symbolic elements that define this important temple site, and a very early one. One is the profile of a feathered serpent that extends his body horizontally across each terrace. Another is the frontal perspective on this serpent's face, with a radial array of feathers. And the third is an intermittent skull feature that ostensibly represents the lifeless and/or resting phase of the serpent, since it shares the same snout, the same paired fangs, and serpent eyes. But this face, frontal view of the face, is pocked with circular structures and sports a goggle-like design across the forehead. Many historians identify this facial feature with the equally popular skull deity and design of the Aztecs known as Tlaloc, because Teotihuacan's impression of this god is unquestionably the prototype to this later Aztec equivalent. A close observation of the skull and serpent face indicates that they are aspects of the same deity, I believe, insofar as they share the same facial features and connect to each other along the extended coils of the feathered dragon, and repeatedly so. However, there is one important feature of this goggled skull motif that is habitually ignored by historians, and that would be the folded stalk of what looks like a floral motif upon Tlaloc's head, the skull's head. There's ample reason to identify this motif as a multi-petaled aquatic flower on several counts. For one, the pigmentation of this symbol follows a color pattern of the water lily on the murals of Tenochtitlan. While most pigments on the temple of Quetzalcoatl have faded after exposure to the valley's intense sunshine, a reconstruction of the temple in Mexico's National Museum of Anthropology matches the petals, the pigmentation of the petals of the flower with the petals of the feathered serpent, the petals that surround the frontal view of the emergent snake as well, which can also be interpreted, conceivably, as petals, given their general aspect. So the feathered serpent possibly represented an aerial ascendant flower stalk, and the skull represented the underworld stage of the flower, after its supple peduncle has folded downward to pull the spent blossom below the water surface to begin fruition. This is the natural cycle of water lily development throughout a year. If we consider again the nearby murals at Tenochtitlan, we see that the recurrent so-called Tlaloc heads, skulls, in these aquatic habitats are intimately and recurrently associated with blue pigmented lotus stalks and flowers. For here, the goggled skull typically disgorges 2 water lily buds and a blossom from his mouth, while upholding 2 trident forms of the flower in his hands. The latter motif representing, as was the case among the Maya, a simplified rendering of the flower's 3 prominent sepals when viewed in profile. The water lily is, in fact, the only large polypetalous, that is, flower with multiple petals, in Mexico that bears 4 prominent sepals, 3 in profile. Moreover, there is some corroborating evidence in a related site that is located a day's walk from Teotihuacan that supports the interpretation of Teotihuacan's bent vegetative motif as a water lily stalk. Not but 3 centuries after the construction of the temple of Quetzalcoatl at Teotihuacan, a famous religious site at Tula, a modern pronunciation of the Aztecs' paradise Tolan, we encounter Tlaloc once again with a water lily issuing from his mouth. And we are informed to take notice of a water lily stalk bundler, a folded and knotted stalk that sustains the drooping blossom from below. So just as the Maya often portrayed their feathered serpent with flowers about the head of the creature and a skull at the tail, this seems to have been a shared practice of the Toltecs and Aztecs as well. Once we recognize parallel iconographic practices relating to water lily imagery in both lowland Maya and upland Mexican sites, notably those of the early Toltecs and later Aztecs, we are prepared to recognize yet other shared conventions in water lily symbolism throughout Mesoamerica. For example, just as the Maya often present water lilies on the nose of their serpents, so too did the Aztecs at Tenochtitlan, the capital of their empire, during post-classic periods, and with bundles of feathers to boot. Or similarly, just as the Maya placed water lily flowers on the tails of their cosmic dragons, so too did the Aztecs, and of course, with bundles of feathers.